I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to you and the ranking member, thank you for agreeing to my participation. I'm not on the subcommittee, but I'm here because there's probably not a subject since I've been in Congress for the last 4 years that I've spent more time on than the issue of the U.S. relationship with Iran, specifically because one of those Americans that people continue to refer to is a young man who lives about a mile from me now, a young man named Amir Hekmati from Flint, Michigan, my hometown, who gratefully, thankfully, as a result of the great work of the agencies represented here, our Secretary of State, the President of the United States, is now a free man at home pursuing the rest of his life. The reason I make that point is that there were very many members of Congress, including some members who have expressed their outrage today in this hearing based on their assumption that there was some connection between these three distinct negotiations that took place, that one was a quid pro quo for the other. There were many members of the House of Representatives who took time at the point that the JCPOA was enacted, agreed to, that the release of these Americans should have been a part of that transaction, and that it wasn't. So I have a bit of concern with what I see as some duplicity here, that on one hand, when it fits the political narrative, the administration is criticized for not making these separate negotiations all combined into one. And when it fits the political narrative a month or two before a presidential election, suddenly we're criticizing the fact that they assume that they were. Well, they can't have it both ways. So, this does not make these negotiations, these agreements does not make Iran a good player on the global stage. There are still a lot of unresolved issues, certainly some regarding their terrorist activities or their support of terrorist activities fits that category. The fact that we still haven't had information about the status of Robert Levinson is another cause of great concern. Many of us continue to press Iran for information regarding his status. But to hear the same voices say that the release of these Americans should have been part of these separate negotiations, now say that they were a part, coming out of the same voices, makes it obvious that what's going on here is simply politics. Sadly, especially when we consider the gravity of not just the relationship between the U.S. and Iran and the rest of the world, particularly in that region, but to bring in the release, the happy release of these Americans into that conversation, I think, is unfortunate. So let me just ask, at what point since 1979 did the United States have any direct negotiations with Iran? Was there any point in time before President Obama and President Rouhani spoke by telephone during the General Assembly? Was there any direct negotiations, face-to-face negotiations, officially between the United States and Iran, between the revolution and that moment in 2013?
Congressman, I wouldn't want to speak to the entire history, but let me summarize, and I think we'll answer your question. Diplomatic contact was basically cut off for that entire period.
I guess the better way to put it, was there ever an opportunity that presented itself to resolve these long-standing disputes through direct negotiation, whether it is the release of the Americans or this dispute that resulted in the payment that's the subject of this hearing? Was there a moment that occurred prior to the JCPOA negotiations that took place that allowed for another track of negotiations to occur simultaneously?
Well, with respect to the Hague Tribunal, as my colleague has noted, we have had ongoing conversations in that tribunal to settle claims. But with respect to the consular issues that you raised, that we do agree are so important, Our first real tangible opportunity to raise those was in the context of the JCPOA, and we took every opportunity in those negotiations, as you note, to raise these particular cases. And it was that channel that allowed us to continue discussions on their ultimate release.
My point, and thank you for that, my point is that it should come as no surprise to anybody observing the relationship between the United States and Iran that for the first time in a very long time, the ability to have bilateral discussion suddenly occurred outside the context of tribunal action. This was bilateral discussion that was able to take place as a result of the JCPOA negotiation. I know that that opened the door for discussions regarding the disposition of the Americans, and I know that it opened the door for discussion regarding the resolution of these long-standing disputes. So the fact that these all took place in a period of time which was coincidental is as a result not of just sudden coincidence, but as a result of a change in the nature of relationship between the two governments. So with that, I know I've exceeded my time. Thank you very much.
Gentleman